Supply chains throughout the world are broken, but why are they broken? What are the things that are causing these constraints and bottlenecks that we're seeing right now? I'm going to talk about that here today. My name is Eric.Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital and business transformations. And one of the key challenges that organizations face today is the fact that supply chains are broken and unreliable. It's a topic that is top of mind for business leaders. Even politicians and the news media and academics are studying and obsessing over the fact that supply chains are broken. And we're seeing it affect our day-to-day lives as well as consumers. We're seeing shortages of products, we're seeing delays on orders that we might make, and businesses are struggling with these same challenges as well. So what I want to talk about today is a root cause analysis of why the supply chain is so broken globally, and more importantly, what can we do to fix that global supply chain? One of the root causes of why the supply chains are broken today is because of labor shortages. Labor markets throughout the world are very uneven at best. In some countries, there's labor shortages in terms of not enough labor to fill key roles and positions within supplier and other aspects of the supply chain. In other cases, there's not the right skill set or the right education levels for resources. And in some cases, there's government incentives to keep people from working, unintentionally so. For example, some countries such as the United States, the governments are offering incentives or paychecks basically to people to not to work as part of the pandemic recovery. So that has an unintended consequence of disincentivizing people from working, and that's certainly affecting supply chains throughout the world. So one of the key things that supply chains need to do in order to get back on track is to make sure that we have the right staffing levels throughout the entire supply chain. And as you can imagine, one domino falls in one part of the supply chain via a labor shortage that affects the rest of the supply chain. That has a domino effect that can create a lot of challenges. So human capital management is something that is going to be very important to supply chains in the 2020s in order to get the supply chains back on track. One of the underlying key challenges of supply chains is that they are focused on the wrong objectives. Supply chains were built prior to 2020 when the pandemic hit and when the supply chains realized a major disruption to the way they operated. And so in the past, supply chain management and the whole discipline of supply chain management tended to focus on how do we optimize cost, how do we reduce cost, how do we increase efficiency, how do we create a just-in-time inventory system to support the supply chain, and it was really focused on efficiency and throughput. But now, in the 2020s, with the way things have changed, customer demands have changed, regulations have changed, a number of disruptions to the world has changed the way supply chains need to operate. Now cost suddenly isn't quite as important as it used to be. Now we've got to think about other objectives in addition to cost. We have to balance out the need to optimize cost with the need for flexibility, for example. How can we respond quickly to macroeconomic or pandemic-related issues or just general issues that might disrupt the supply chain? We need to build that sort of flexibility into supply chains in a way that hasn't been done or hasn't needed to be done in the past. Another consideration is the fact that a lot of organizations now are thinking about sustainability and the impact that supply chains have on the climate. So now it's not enough just to say we found a low-cost supplier to fulfill our supply chain needs. Now it's a matter of looking at cost, but also looking at things like the ability to support flexibility, as I mentioned before, and to support sustainability or climate change types of objectives and initiatives. So a lot of organizations that place a premium on the focus on climate change, or in some cases, government regulations are imposing those needs to focus on climate change, that affects the types of suppliers we work with. So that's another consideration in terms of making sure that we have the right objectives as a supply chain management function, and in the past, that historically has not been a consideration. And then finally, now supply chains need to make sure that we have the right products to the right customers at the right time. In the past, that may have sounded like a no-brainer or sort of been a given, but that's exactly what supply chains are struggling to do right now, is to get the products to the customers at the right time and to manufacture the products in time to get those products to the customers at the right time. So that's some of the objectives that now need to be incorporated into your overall supply chain management strategy. And these objectives were certainly not nearly as important in the past as they are now in a post-pandemic world. we learned one thing in the 2020 so far, it's that supply chains have a very concentrated level of risk. And what I mean by that is we've depended on the same suppliers or the sole suppliers to provide key resources or raw material inputs or sub-assemblies into our products. Or we've relied on single 3PL providers to provide logistics for our organization. Or perhaps we've relied on a single port for overseas products coming into your given country. And in the past, that may have worked perfectly fine in a very predictable, stable world. But now we're living in an unpredictable, less stable world that requires a lot more flexibility and a decentralization of risk. So rather than being overly dependent on one raw material provider or one 3PL provider or one port for all of your products coming in and out, we now need to look at what are our backup plans. How do we diversify our risk? How do we hedge our risk to make sure that any one disruption in the supply chain isn't going to completely throw off the rest of the supply chain? So for example, in the United States, where Third Stage is based, some of the ports in California have realized extreme bottlenecks. And a lot of organizations have always depended on those ports in California for their products to come through. But now, in order to get products in a timely manner, organizations need to be thinking outside of the California ports. Even if they're a West Coast organization, they might need to look at the East Coast and looking at some of the ports that are available to them there and shipping the product via land to get them where they need to be, the end products. So that's just one example of how that concentration of risk has created a lot of problems and caught a lot of supply chains flat-footed and unable to cope with the current environment. So going forward, organizations need to focus on how do we ensure that we're flexible and that we neutralize some of those risks that we see in certain dependencies on sole suppliers. Another challenge with supply chains is a lot of supply chain managers don't have good visibility into what's happening throughout the supply chain. And that begins with the raw materials that go into the production of your product. That also continues into the sub-assemblies or the major components that you might be procuring for your product. It goes into your manufacturing operations, your warehouse operations, your shipping, your logistics, all the procurement processes that support those processes, and ultimately distribution to your end customer. And so that visibility is very important. And that sounds very simple, it sounds very basic, but a lot of organizations don't have that visibility and insight into what's happening throughout the supply chain. And now even if we look at just our own supply chain, we also have to look outside of our supply chain as well. Look at our end customers and understand what that demand forecast is and what their purchasing patterns are and what our anticipated demand is from those customers. We have to have good visibility into that to be able to plan our supply chain accordingly. And then on the supplier side, we aren't just looking at the immediate suppliers. In some cases, we need to look beyond our immediate supplier and look to the suppliers. If there's raw materials that are being provided to a vendor or supplier of ours that's providing a component that's semi-finished, we need to understand what availability do we have on the raw material side, which might be 2 tiers removed in the supply chain. So it not only pertains to understanding and having visibility into our immediate supply chain, but even layers outside of that supply chain as well. And the better visibility we can get into that, the more effective we're going to be in planning and executing our supply chain management strategies for the 2020s. Now, so far I've talked about 4 limitations and problems with supply chains, and those 4 things all tie back to a 5th one, which is technology limitations. A lot of organizations don't have the right technologies, the right software, the right applications, the right automation, the right predictive analytics, the right tools to be able to have all the things that I just mentioned. So, for example, a lot of organizations now are finding that by deploying supply chain management automation, by supplying artificial intelligence technologies, by providing better business intelligence, predictive analytics, providing better visibility overall via automated technology tool sets is one of the best ways to mitigate the other 4 risks that I've already talked about. So now is a great time to really look at your technologies and understand what's working well, what are those strengths that you have right now, what's working well with your supply chain, and where are those risks and vulnerabilities and pain points that you have right now, and how could technology potentially enable some improvements along those lines. So this pertains to not only supply chain management technologies, but also to enterprise resource planning, ERP systems. It also pertains to CRM systems and ensuring that your sales force has automated processes and that we're centralizing that capturing of data so that it can feed into our supply chain planning processes on the CRM side. Similarly, we talked about labor shortages as the first thing we talked about in this video. Human capital management technologies can be a great way to ensure that we mitigate some of those labor shortages, that we attract and retain the right talent to ensure that we don't continue to experience those labor shortages. So these are just a few examples of how technology can help mitigate some of the challenges that we've talked about so far here today. Now, I hope this has provided you a good overview of how supply chain management, supply chains in general, are struggling in the 2020s. And I hope it's also provided some insights as to how you can improve those supply chains in the future. Now, for more information on how you might transform your organization via digital transformation, I encourage you to download our annual digital transformation report, which contains top 10 rankings of supply chain management systems as well as other types of enterprise technologies. It also provides some best practices to help you ensure that you're going through your digital transformation in a way that's going to be successful for your organization. So I encourage you to download that report as well as some of the other resources I've included links to below. So I hope you found this information useful. Hope you have a great day.